What if the man who would later lead the greatest military alliance in history was told, quietly, firmly, and without appeal, that his most critical request before the most dangerous operation of the Second World War had been denied? What if the man who denied it was the one person on earth with the authority to say yes, and he chose not to? This is not a hypothetical. This happened. In the spring of 1944, as the fate of the free world hung over the beaches of Normandy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower made a request so urgent, so deeply personal, and so militarily consequential that he put it in writing. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt looked at it, and said no. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. But with the cold, calculated certainty of a man who understood that some decisions, no matter how painful, must be made by one man alone. The question is, what did Eisenhower ask for? And why was the answer no? If this kind of story, where history turns not on battles, but on the quiet decisions made behind closed doors, is something that moves you, then subscribe to this channel right now, like this video, and share it with someone who loves real history. And drop a comment telling us, what surprised you most so far? We read every single one. The year was 1944, and the war in Europe had reached a point of no return. Adolf Hitler's forces still occupied France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and much of the European continent. The Soviet Union was bleeding from the east, having suffered casualties that defied comprehension, over 20 million dead. The pressure on the Allied leadership was immense, almost suffocating. Every week of delay cost lives. Every miscalculation risked catastrophe. Into this crucible stepped Dwight David Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. A man who had never commanded troops in actual combat before being handed the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. He was not a battlefield general in the mold of George S. Patton. He was something rarer, a coalition builder, a diplomat in uniform, a man who could hold together British pride, American ambition, French honor, and Canadian determination without letting any of them shatter the whole. Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, had been in planning since 1943. The target was the coast of Normandy, a stretch of French shoreline that the Germans had fortified into what they called the Atlantic Wall. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been tasked by Hitler himself with making those beaches impenetrable. Rommel worked with terrifying efficiency. He oversaw the laying of millions of mines, the construction of steel obstacles in the surf, the reinforcement of concrete bunkers, and the positioning of artillery that could turn the English Channel into a graveyard. Rommel believed the invasion would be decided in the first 24 hours. If we don't repel them at the water's edge, he told his officers, we will not repel them at all. He was not wrong. And Eisenhower knew it. By the spring of 1944, Eisenhower had assembled a force of staggering proportions. Nearly 3 million soldiers, sailors, and airmen from 12 nations were being prepared in southern England. The logistics alone were a miracle of organization. 11,000 aircraft, 7,000 naval vessels, mountains of ammunition, blood plasma, rations, and equipment stretching from Cornwall to Kent. But Eisenhower carried a weight that no logistics chart could measure. He understood, with mathematical clarity, what the casualty projections said. The men who would land on Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, were walking into the most heavily defended killing zone in the world. And Eisenhower knew that without one specific form of support, one critical military asset, the cost in human lives would rise from catastrophic to almost unthinkable. That asset was the strategic bombing force. Specifically, Eisenhower wanted control, direct, unambiguous, operational control, over the heavy bombers of both the United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Forces Bomber Command. He wanted to redirect those bombers away from their ongoing campaigns deep into Germany, attacks on industrial targets, oil refineries, and cities, and use them instead to systematically destroy the French railway network, the roads, the bridges, the fuel depots, and the German defensive positions in and around Normandy. This plan, developed by British scientist Solly Zuckerman and championed by Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's own deputy, became known as the Transportation Plan. It was not a new idea, it was a proven concept. But claiming control of the strategic bombers meant taking them away from two extraordinarily powerful men who did not want to give them up. The first was General Karl Tui Spatz, commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The second, and more ferocious in his resistance, was Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris, commander of RAF Bomber Command, a man so devoted to his theory of area bombing that his own men called him Bomber Harris. Both men believed, with religious conviction, that strategic bombing alone could break Germany's industrial capacity and win the war without an invasion at all. To divert their bombers to French railways and Normandy gun emplacements was, in their view, not just inefficient, it was a betrayal of everything they had built. Harris wrote memoranda of scorching intensity. Spaatz lobbied at the highest levels of the American military. And beyond the military debate, there was a political dimension that made everything more explosive: Winston Churchill. Churchill was terrified. Not of the Germans in this particular moment, but of what the transportation plan would do to the French people. Allied bombers were not precision instruments in 1944. The plan to destroy French railways and road hubs would inevitably kill French civilians. People living under occupation, people the Allies were supposedly coming to liberate. Churchill's estimates, drawn from his own intelligence services, suggested that as many as 80,000 French civilians could die as a result of the bombing campaign. He brought these numbers to Roosevelt personally. He wrote letter after letter. He argued in the War Cabinet. He appealed to morality, to politics, to the post-war relationship between Britain, America, and France. Churchill's resistance was so intense and so sustained that it threatened to derail Eisenhower's entire pre-invasion strategy. And that is when Eisenhower wrote his letter to Roosevelt. The letter was direct, urgent, and deeply revealing of the man who wrote it. Eisenhower told Roosevelt that without control of the strategic bombing forces, he could not guarantee the success of Operation Overlord. He argued that the transportation plan was not a preference, it was a military necessity. He said that if he was to be held responsible for the outcome of the invasion, he must have the tools required to carry it out. And he asked Roosevelt, clearly, explicitly, to intervene, to override Churchill's objections, to grant him, Eisenhower, command authority over the strategic air forces. It was a bold request. It was, in many ways, an extraordinary one. A theater commander asking the Commander-in-Chief of the United States to step into an inter-allied dispute and impose a solution. And it placed Roosevelt in an almost impossible position. Right here, at this exact midpoint in one of the most consequential stories of the 20th century, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with a friend who loves real history. And leave us a comment. Did you know that Eisenhower almost didn't have control of the bombers before D-Day? Tell us what you're discovering as you watch. Roosevelt's answer was no, but the full story of that no is what separates history from legend. Roosevelt did not refuse because he doubted Eisenhower. He refused because he understood that the question Eisenhower was asking him to answer was not purely military. It was political in the deepest sense. To override Churchill on French civilian casualties was to risk fracturing the Anglo-American alliance at the precise moment it needed to be most united. Churchill was not simply being sentimental. He was reflecting a legitimate moral and political concern that would echo through the post-war world. Roosevelt, with the long strategic vision that defined his presidency, chose not to issue a direct order. Instead, he did something more subtle and, ultimately, more effective. He wrote back to Churchill personally on April 11, 1944, and told him that while he shared his concerns about French civilian casualties, the military considerations must take precedence, and that he was prepared to accept responsibility for the decision. That letter changed everything. With Roosevelt's personal backing clearly signaled, even if not formalized as a direct command, the political resistance began to crumble. Churchill, who was many things but never a man who would abandon a settled decision by his closest ally, ultimately acquiesced. By mid-April 1944, Eisenhower received what he needed, not through a formal order granting him absolute control, but through a practical arrangement that gave him effective authority over the strategic bombing forces for the pre-invasion period. The bombers began flying the missions he had planned. Bridges were destroyed. Rail yards were cratered. German supply lines into Normandy were severed. By June 6, 1944, D-Day, the transportation plan had degraded German logistics so severely that Rommel's forces could not move reinforcements quickly enough to throw the Allies back into the sea during that critical first 24 hours. The French civilian casualties were real and devastating. Estimates suggest approximately 12,000 French and Belgian civilians died as a result of the pre-invasion bombing campaign. That number must never be minimized. It is part of the moral ledger of that terrible war, carried by history with full weight. But the beaches held. The Allied forces, at enormous cost, more than 10,000 casualties on D-Day alone, established their foothold. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. By May 8, 1945, Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The decision Roosevelt made, not to grant Eisenhower's request directly, but to resolve it through diplomatic wisdom rather than executive force, preserved the alliance, protected Churchill's authority, and still delivered the outcome Eisenhower needed. It was one of the most consequential quiet decisions in the history of modern leadership. And it happened in letters, in conference rooms, and in the careful silences between men who understood that some battles are won not with weapons, but with judgment. If this story reached something in you, if the weight of these decisions, the lives they affected, and the human beings behind them moved you in any way, then please subscribe to this channel right now and click like on this video. Share it with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II, because history is always deeper than we imagine. And leave a comment below telling us what you didn't know before watching this. Whether it was Roosevelt's diplomatic approach, Churchill's fear for French civilians, Eisenhower's letter, or Rommel's words about the first 24 hours. Your comment keeps stories like this alive, and it helps more people find the real history that still has the power to change how we see the world we live in today.